Evolutionary perspectives on altruism. Although people generally associate evolutionary theory with Charles Darwin, his theory represents just one theory of its type. It is, of course, the original theory, and it has had a profound scientific, social, and political impact on how people view the world. Subsequent theories, drawing on principles of sociobiology and modern genetics, have also been developed. We begin this section with Darwin's view of evolution, which is portrayed in his classic 1859 book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. We then consider alternative and more recent formulations of evolutionary theory. Darwin's Principles of Natural Selection. Almost the date of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, there was an interesting problem for evolutionary theorists. It begins with the original version of the theory of natural selection, which was proposed by one of Darwin's close collaborators, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace's theory contained four simple, interrelated principles. The first of these was called the principle of variation, which says that members of species vary in their physiological and behavioral traits. The second principle, inheritance, says that at least some portion of this variation is inherited from one's ancestors. According to the third principle, adaptation, there is almost always competition among members of a species for food and other scarce resources, and, because of variation, some individual members are able to compete more effectively than others. This leads to the fourth and critical principle, evolution, which states that those individuals who are most effective at competition are the most likely to survive, reproduce, and produce children with similar traits. This is the concept of survival of the fittest. According to Darwin, nature is red in tooth and claw, and it is the struggle of all against all. The big question for altruism is, if this is true, how could a tendency for self-sacrifice have evolved? Some theorists have tried to resolve the conflict by suggesting that altruistic behavior is more apparent than real. The economy of nature is competitive from beginning to end. The impulses that lead one animal to sacrifice himself for another turn out to have their ultimate rationale in gaining advantage over a third. Where it is in his own interest, every organism may reasonably be expected to aid his fellows. Yet given a full chance to act in his own interest, nothing but expediency will restrain him from brutalizing, from maiming, from murdering his brother, his mate, his parent, or his child. Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. Gislin, 1974. Other people have argued that the inconsistency between the evolutionary notion of survival of the fittest and the existence of altruism demonstrates a basic fallacy in the theory of evolution. Indeed, even today, people who take a strong biblical view of the origins of humans, creationists, use altruism among humans and animals as part of their campaign against evolutionary theory. Consider this quote from the Crystal Clear Creation website. There are many examples of animals helping other animals, which shows that the evolutionary idea of survival of the fittest is flawed. We believe that the explanation for helpful animals cannot be found in a purposeless theory like evolution, but rather in understanding that God the Creator has placed the world's array of animals on Earth for His glory, as they fill particular roles in the planet's ecology. There were flaws in early evolutionary theory, but they were not the ones identified on this website. And it turns out that there is nothing inconsistent between the existence of altruistic action and the mechanisms involved in evolution. To the contrary, there is good reason to believe that altruism, as we have defined it in this chapter, can often increase the probability that a person's traits will be passed on to a subsequent generation. As scholars became more aware of this possibility, new evolutionary perspectives were developed. New evolutionary perspectives. In the early 1960s, some prominent evolutionary theorists began to modify the original Darwinian model in some fairly substantial ways. These new ideas diverged from the Darwinian perspective in one very important respect. The focus turned away from the survival of an individual person to the survival of that individual's genes as the primary mechanism by which evolution occurs. This led to a reconsideration of the benefits of altruism for survival. The evolutionary benefits of altruism. We begin our discussion of how altruism can produce evolutionary benefits with a personal and painful example of altruism among insects. One of the authors of this book is a gardener. One summer, there was a beehive under the boards of her house near her garden. Every time she tried to weed the section of the garden near the hive, a few guard bees came out and buzzed her. Usually she retreated. One day she did not. Her nose was sore for days from the suicidal attack of one of those guards. The guard bee made the supreme sacrifice in the act of protecting the hive. Stinging someone is fatal to a bee. When it embedded its stinger in the victim's nose and then withdrew, the bee died. But bees are not nature's only altruists. Observations of other animals, ranging from bats to prairie dogs to lions to baboons to humans, also find that within species cooperation and prosocial actions are extremely common, and many of them at least appear to be selfless and altruistic. Brock, 2002, Griffin and West, 2003. Consider the bee who dies to protect the hive, the prairie dog that puts itself at risk to warn others of the presence of a dangerous predator, the baboon who challenges the leopard, or people who risk their lives to save others in the stories that appear throughout this book. These individuals clearly reduce their personal chances of survival. Members of a species who sacrifice their lives for others will, on the average, have fewer offspring than those who save themselves. Worker bees, of course, have no children of their own, perhaps explaining their extreme altruism. Thus, in Darwin's terms, these individuals cannot be the fittest. Nevertheless, the more current evolutionary perspectives suggest mechanisms that might allow for the development of innate altruistic tendencies. In the next section, we consider several processes whereby altruism could lead to evolutionary success. Following that section, we examine environmental and social conditions that might foster the evolution of altruistic behavior. Evolutionary mechanisms, genes, not people. How can altruistic tendencies evolve when altruists, by definition, are less likely to survive? To answer this, we must reconsider how evolution takes place. Recall that the original evolutionary view was that natural selection takes place at the level of the individual, that the fittest people will survive. They did not consider another possibility, that evolution takes place at the level of genes. Buss, 2004. The reason for this was that Darwin and his contemporaries were simply not aware of what genes were and the role they play in the transmission of traits across generations. The role of genes in this process was not understood until many years after Darwin's death. But according to contemporary evolutionary theorists, it is not the survival of the organism that is critical in evolutionary success, but rather it is the survival of the gene. According to Ridley and Dawkins, 1984, the animal can be regarded as a machine designed to preserve copies of the genes inside it. Hamilton, 1964, coined the term inclusive fitness to describe the successful transmission of an individual's genes to a subsequent gene pool. Inclusive fitness concerns not the number of direct descendants the individual has in a subsequent generation, but rather the number of copies of his or her genes that are present in the next generation. Individuals can increase their fitness either by directly passing their genes on to their descendants or by aiding in the reproduction of other individuals who carry the same genes. If altruistic traits increase inclusive fitness and have a genetic basis, they will be passed on across generations, along with the altruistic individual's other characteristics. This principle is fundamental to three current influential evolutionary theories: kin selection, reciprocal altruism, and group selection. Kin selection theory. A common sentiment among most, if not all, parents is that whatever their children do, they will still love and care for them. This is, of course, what good parents are supposed to say and do. However, genetic theories of the origins of altruism suggest that the sentiment may be more than just a self-serving refrain. Specifically, Kin selection theory focuses on the actions of people who are genetically related. It proposes that the children of a parent who is totally indifferent to their needs are unlikely to survive. Thus, a neglectful parent gene, which might have been passed on to those unfortunate offspring, is unlikely to survive. Thus, it is quite reasonable to propose that the vast majority of parents are genetically inclined to be altruistic toward their children. Note that we have momentarily returned to the social psychological definition of altruism, help that is primarily intended to benefit another person. Unfortunately, there are dramatic and tragic exceptions to these general tendencies. Pathologically abusive and uncaring parents are, however, very much the exception rather than the rule, and there is evidence that this behavior is substantially environmentally determined. Strauss, 1992. What evidence is there to support the concept of kin selection? Much of the empirical work on kin selection has focused on the relationship between relatedness, i.e., the percentage of genes two individuals share in common, and willingness to help. Some of the most dramatic examples of altruism among other animals involve self-sacrifice by parents to benefit their offspring. Many ground-nesting birds, such as the killdeer, attempt to distract predators who threaten their young. As the predator approaches, the parent leaves the nest to attract attention to itself, limping as if its wing were injured. The predator, spying easy prey, is lured away from the nest to stalk the injured parent. At the last possible moment, the bird abandons all deceptive pretense and takes to the air, leaving the predator confused and hungry. The animal that threatened the nest is now disoriented and some distance away. It is unlikely that it will be able to find the nest and the helpless young birds in it. In this way, the young are saved, but only at great risk to the parent. Studies of other animals also indicate a preference for helping relatives and other members of the social group over non-relatives and strangers. For example, Curry, 1988, observed that mockingbirds were more likely to feed hungry, closely related nestlings, other than their own, than they were to feed unrelated nestlings. Sherman, 1985, found that when threatened by predators such as coyotes and weasels, ground squirrels were much more likely to warn genetically related squirrels and squirrels with whom they lived than to warn unrelated squirrels or those from other areas. Figure 2.1 presents the results of another study on kinship and helping in animals. Sherman, 1981. In this study, Sherman recorded the percentage of female squirrels that helped another squirrel chase away animals who entered the first squirrel's territory. The figure shows that the greatest percentage of cooperative chases occurred among mothers, daughters, and sisters. Note that the more closely related the animals were, the more cooperation there was between them. Figure 2.1. More closely related squirrels are more cooperative in the defense of space. So on the x-axis are the categories of the relationship: mother-daughter, sisters, aunt-niece, first cousins, and non-kin. And on the y-axis is percent of cooperative defenses from 0 to 20%. So the mother-daughter relationship predicted 15% of cooperative defense, sisters was 10%, aunt-niece was about 4%, first cousins was about 5%, and non-kin was about 4%. So you can see that the mother-daughter relationship definitely increases the percent of cooperative defenses, and so does sisters, which are closer relationships than aunt-niece or first cousins. Why does self-sacrifice for one's own relatives make evolutionary sense? Remember that from this new evolutionary perspective, the sole purpose of reproduction is to increase the incidence of one's genes in subsequent generations. A parent passes on approximately 50% of its genes to each of its offspring. Thus, if an altruistic father gives his life to ensure the survival of at least 2 of his offspring and they are fertile, there is no net loss of his genes in the species. As described in more detail in box 2.1, under some conditions altruists who help other relatives can substantially increase the likelihood of their own genes being passed on to successive generations. The examples presented in this box show how an altruist who gives her life to save the lives of her siblings, or even her siblings' children, can do more to pass on her genes, that is, to increase her inclusive fitness, than does a non-altruist who saves her own life at the expense of her relatives' lives. As long as relatives live near each other or can be recognized as relatives, so that altruistic actions can usually be directed toward kin, an altruistic gene will survive and, in fact, outcompete a selfish gene. The cross-cultural evidence for kin selection is also supportive. Data from 13 anthropological studies across a wide variety of cultures revealed that relatives were given more help overall than non-relatives, with close kin receiving the most help. Essek Vital and McGuire, 1985. The more closely people are related genetically, the more helpful they are to one another. For example, in a study of living kidney donors, Borgida, Connor, and Mantufal, 1992, found that donors were about 3 times as likely to do this for a relative as for a non-relative, 73% versus 27%. However, there are other possible explanations of greater helping among relatives. For example, it may simply be that people feel more obligated to help their kin than unrelated strangers because of social pressure from one's family to help relatives. Much more persuasive evidence for kin selection comes from studies in which predictions derived from this theory were essentially pitted against social norms and rules for helping. One of the most notable of these studies was conducted by Bernstein, Crandall, and Kitayama, 1994. They asked students from the United States and Japan to imagine they were in a situation where they were forced to choose among 3 people who asked them for either an everyday, e.g. running an errand, or a life or death form of helping, e.g. saving someone from a fire. The characteristics of the people in need were also systematically varied. Most relevant here, Bernstein et al. Manipulated how closely related the person asking the favor was to the potential helper. Within both cultures, life or death helping was significantly more likely to be offered with closer genetic relatedness between the helper and the target. Thus, siblings were more likely to be helped than cousins, and cousins more likely to be helped than unrelated friends. Relatedness had much less effect on mundane, everyday helping, as evolutionary theory would suggest. But remember that the theory of kin selection does not say we will always help close relatives. Rather, it proposes that we are most likely to do this when it benefits our own inclusive fitness. Thus, kin selection theory would predict that life or death helping of a close relative would decrease if, for some reason, the relative was not likely to produce offspring. Bernstein and his associates tested such ideas. For example, they varied the age and the health of the relatives who needed help to survive. With regard to age, relatives who were beyond the age when they probably could produce children were less likely to receive life or death helping than younger relatives. This finding also did not occur for everyday helping. Box 2.1. The genetic benefits of altruism. From a genetic perspective, the survival of a group of related individuals depends on the survival of its gene pool. Altruism is any self-sacrificing action that contributes to this goal. Geneticists also believe that altruist genes can be maintained in a gene pool even if their actions result in their death before they have offspring. To explain this paradoxical statement, we must introduce the concept of relatedness. Relatedness represents the probability that a selected gene from one individual will be represented in a relative. For example, the probability that a parent and child will share a gene is 0.5, the same probability that siblings, brothers and sisters, will share a particular gene. The probability that aunts and uncles will share a selected gene with nieces and nephews is 0.25. If altruistic actions increase the reproductive success, i.e. the probability that an individual will have offspring, of genetic relatives of the altruist, this can also increase the genetic success, i.e. the likelihood that a specific gene will be passed on to subsequent generations of the altruist genes. To illustrate this concept, we present 3 hypothetical cases. in which a person must choose between an altruistic and a selfish action. To simplify the matter, in all three cases, the reproductive success of the individuals involved is assumed to be the same, but they would all have one offspring. Case 1. Choosing between saving one's own life or the lives of 3 siblings. Which choice is more likely to preserve the actor's genes in the group's gene pool? Answer: saving the 3 siblings. Explanation: the genetic benefit of saving oneself would be 0.5, assuming one offspring in the future. This is outweighed by the genetic benefit of saving 3 brothers or sisters, which each have a 0.5 probability of sharing a gene with the altruist. Thus, the probable genetic benefit to the altruist would be 1.5. 3 persons times 0.5 equals 1.5. The net benefit is therefore plus 1.0. 1.5 minus 0.5. Case 2. Choosing between saving one's own life or the lives of 3 nieces or nephews, which choice is more likely to preserve the actor's genes in the group's gene pool? Answer: saving the 3 nieces and nephews. Explanation: again, the genetic benefit of saving oneself is 0.5, 1 person times 0.5. This benefit is less than the genetic benefit of saving the 3 nieces and nephews. The probability of each of them sharing a gene in common with the altruist is 0.25. Thus, the probable genetic benefits of this action are 0.75. 3 times 0.25 equals 0.75. The net benefit is plus 0.25.